Hey again, everyone. I'm here with Lorna Hecht, who is a licensed therapist in California, and I am Miriam Bellamy of Whole Family Neurofeedback, also a licensed marriage and family therapist here in Colorado. And so we're working on this series to help parents get the most out of neurofeedback and really have realistic expectations of neurofeedback. I think, and Lorna, I think you've seen this too. It's the most powerful tool I've seen. That's on the sort of quick and dirty side for helping people, process through. But we still have to process through life. I like to tell people sometimes, your kid's still going to be your kid after this, right? You're still going to be yourself. But I think it really helps with processing and moving forward. So today we thought we would talk about improved decision-making in parenting. And how does neurofeedback help with that? I think Lorna and I talked about how with Neuroptimal, it really helps improve resilience and flexibility. So resilience, I've heard Dr. Brown describe as the ability to stick with something despite the stresses that are going on around you. And then flexibility is the ability to step away from something you might be holding on to that circumstances might suggest you need to step away from. So I think it's pretty profound in that direction. And then it helps improve your processing, your decision making, which is what we'll be talking about today. So how do you want to weigh in there, Lorna?
Well, good morning. In terms of decision making, in my experience, the Neuroptimal, it actually does seem that new thinking comes to me. I'll think about a problem, or I'll be in a familiar situation, and a new thought will just come to me that I know is new for my repertoire. And so that's a nice feeling. I really like that, and I think that speaks to the flexibility that the Neuroptimal promotes subconsciously without any effort on one's part, just beyond hooking up and your 33 minutes on the equipment. But that's a lucky thing when the new thought comes into my head. But more often, the increase in resilience and flexibility offers the opportunity to deliberately think about an old problem a new way and come up with new solutions. And that's where Victoria Harrison, who is an expert in family systems theory and in using neurofeedback, would say the opportunity to work on differentiation of self or one's own mature and responsible relationship in the family comes in.
Can you say more about that? Differentiation of self? That's a big term.
Differentiation of self. Perhaps for the purposes today, the best way to think about it is families are really involved with, every family member is so involved with each other emotionally and for such a long period of time, and not even just the nuclear family. There's all the generations that came before, one folding into the next. So patterns of interacting become so automatic. I think everybody's even had the experience of, I can't believe this is happening to me again. I can't believe I'm doing this again. I told myself I would never do this again, and here I am doing it again, right?
Yeah, in a big way with our kids, right?
And in a very big way I'm fighting about the bedroom again. So differentiation of self is actually taking responsibility for one's part in that automatic process. And working to manage self more deliberately, more thoughtfully, and more maturely.
Yeah, and I'm interested in what you said about having new thoughts or a new take on old problems. I think that is incredibly helpful with parenting because we do really get stuck in thinking of it, thinking of our children in certain ways, right? I can't believe she's still doing this. What's wrong with her? Or he did what?
Or how about this one? Oh, there he goes again, just like his father.
Oh,
How about that one?
yeah. Yeah, that's a big one.
That's
So,
a big one.
so neurofeedback helps people to sort of step back from that a little bit. I think Bowen theory really helps with that too. That stepping back and developing a new idea about the same old problems. So, I don't know, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, one of the reasons I started using neurofeedback, so this is a bit of a personal take on it. One of the reasons I started using neurofeedback is because I'd been studying Bowen theory, trying to apply the principles in my own life for, several years, certainly not nearly as long as many other people. And I'm a bit impatient with my own progress. But I thought it doesn't matter how much I know about the principles. My automatic reactions are so intense and so immediate that I'm not able to change the patterns.
Uh-huh.
And so that is the specific reason why I started training with neurofeedback. And indeed, I have found a little bit more of an observer view of my own reactions. And this is something that I've actually heard from every person who's been training with neurofeedback for a while. A little somehow distance between the emotional reaction and thinking about the emotional reaction. And it's in that space that I'm better able to plan for new behaviors. Maybe not in this moment, but the next time the same old comes up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking of a woman who is here in the area where I live, who was having difficulty waking up through the night. And she started neurofeedback, and with just a few sessions, she would still wake up, but before she would think about whatever was bothering her, and it would just sort of keep her awake. And she described it exactly like you said, unprompted. She felt like she had some distance from it and was able to go right back to sleep. It still was upsetting as she didn't feel like, rainbows and butterflies, but she was able to get right back to sleep. And then, of course, progressively over time that she just would sleep through.
So the neurofeedback people talk about the diffs, right? The duration, intensity, and frequency of a symptom. And that's a great example where she still had the symptom, but the duration, intensity, and frequency was diminishing.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some examples of how parenting decision-making can become a little bit different. What are some new ideas or some new thinking that you've seen?
Well, I think that it often involves, the original thinking would be, I'm really mad at my kid or worried about my kid, and I have to do A, B, or C in reaction to that, or something terrible will happen. Because my child is not behaving properly or has this problem. Mm-hmm. And what I think the neurofeedback facilitates with some deliberation on the part of the parent is where the parent fits into the problem. So instead of thinking my kid is irresponsible or lazy or has a condition, ADD or something, a motivated parent can start to see, when my child does this, I do this. And then when I do this, my child does this. Mm-hmm. And there's actually a vicious cycle going on. Mm-hmm. So when my... Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
So when my kid, it looks like he's daydreaming when he's supposed to do his homework, I start getting after him and chastising him and making him show me what he did. And then he seems to get really upset. And then next thing you know, we're arguing. And then it takes until midnight to get the homework done. And what I'm now understanding, this person might say, is that I'm getting my child more upset and that's actually interfering with his ability to focus on his homework. But he's playing his part by acting disinterested, and that triggers me. So how do I break this vicious cycle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think what we're saying is, or what you're suggesting is, just do nothing.
Well, it might be, depending on the age of the child. At some age, a parent might decide, this homework thing is really between the child and his teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to stay out of it because I've never been helpful anyway. And someday he's going to have to learn how to manage his own stuff.
Mm.
Now, I like the idea of that happening at about age 6, but other people will disagree with me.
6 sounds about right to me.
But everybody has to find their own path and what they have the stomach for.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is how to maybe, instead of micromanaging the process, but you don't want to be completely oblivious to it, would be, how can I work on regulating myself and what I'm going to do in the event that schoolwork isn't done, versus how can I get my kid to do her schoolwork?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How can I regulate myself?
Which only becomes available as an option. How can I regulate myself? Once I identify how I'm part of the problem.
I think there's so difficult for parents to embrace that, because the feeling is, my kid's, let's say, messing up at school, or let's go to getting in trouble with the law. I must be doing something wrong, and I have to act, right? Hard to recognize what we're doing is making it worse. I think the harder part, though, is I have to self-regulate. What are you talking about? My kid's out of control, I'm just thinking about, Neuroptimal would help with that. Help a person not just go with that, because that's a pretty anxious, I guess, way to think about it, or to react as a parent.
So I think you are, more than any other voice in the Neuroptimal community, you are advocating that if your child has a problem, put them on the Neuroptimal, that's great, but don't neglect your own part and your own self. And that a calmer, more thoughtful parent is probably worth more than the benefits of just putting a child on alone.
Yeah. Yeah, this
mm-hmm.
makes me think of an example, if I can share. A woman who rented last fall, who had a couple of sons, one of which was right on the cusp of middle school, who was violent with her. And she was really concerned about whether she could even get him to do the training. And I just encouraged her to do the training yourself, right? And she did. She really buckled down and committed to that. And her husband, as she went along, her husband began to come along with her, who, as I learned, was very, had a lot of health problems, horrible chronic pain, debilitating pain. And he started to improve. And she was able to observe how much more affectionate and loving that young boy was with her. He didn't do any neurofeedback.
So this is a really good example. What you just said, it's so hard for the parent to see if my child is running amok, getting in trouble with the law, and my husband is sick and has all these problems. I don't have the problem. I'm coping with the problem.
Yeah.
So how do you think that you appealed to this woman in such a way that she could hear that she had power too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she came with a little bit of that, some willingness and some openness to do something. I think they had tried many, many things. And I think I just listened to her. I took her seriously. And I think that goes a long way.
Well, Dr. Kerr, I think, might be the person who talks a little bit about when people are at the end of their rope
Mm-hmm.
They may be more open
Mm-hmm.
to saying, okay,
Yeah.
what can I do?
Yeah. 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 And a lot of people who approach us, right, are at the end of their rope. They're trying out this weird sounding new thing called neurofeedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So you and I were talking earlier about how one person in the family can make changes
Mm-hmm.
through therapy and or with neurofeedback, but that doesn't always magically play out. It does always magically play out through the system, but maybe not in the way one imagines or desires. That
Like
there
you
can
say, you're not going to get a big fat thank you.
not going to get a big fat thank you, and you know, what's that about?
What is that about, Lorna?
What is so?
Because I want that to change.
I want that to change.
I want to thank you.
So the story that I was thinking about with that was a young man that I work with. At some point, he realized that his wife would say, I want to go out to dinner. Let's go out to dinner. Where do you want to go? And he would always say, I don't care, whatever you want. And he thought he was being amenable, but she didn't like it. And so, you know, after he and I talked about it, he realized he was making her do all the work, the thinking and the planning, you know, being easygoing. Yeah, that's nice, but not helpful. Mm-hmm. So he went home and she says, you know, I'd like to go out to dinner. And he says, oh, okay, well, here's an option that I'd like to do tonight. And she's like, no, I'm not in the mood for that. And then he says, well, here's the other choice. And she says, oh, gosh, no, that's too expensive. And then he gives one more. And she's like, you know, we just had that last week. Such a great example. Yeah. And so, of course, at that point, what are the chances that he would go, I don't care, it's up to you? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they would be right back at square one. Mm-hmm. And so that's a beautiful example of a change back reaction. The family's natural, not deliberate, not intentional effort to keep things the way they are.
Can you go over that one more time? Because not everybody may have listened to that podcast. What are those? You said there were 4 stages of change. Is that what you call them?
That's what I call them. Yeah. Borrowing from theory, but thinking about it for myself is that somebody does something different. I'm going to come up with a suggestion for the restaurant. And the system immediately says, well, that feels funny. That's uncomfortable. That change might be a little threatening in some way. And I want you to change back. Do what's familiar. So there'll be some actual behavior in the service of pushing things back to the status quo. And then this is where, in this case, the gentleman is either going to give up, never mind, whatever you want, dear, or he's going to stay the course. Mm-hmm. No, tonight it's Indian food. That's what I want. Mm-hmm. And if he does stay the course, that's where the magic happens. That's where the system moves to a higher level. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if Neuroptimal indeed builds resilience in the brain, mm-hmm. then presumably it'll make it a little easier for that third phase, stay the course. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, stick-to-itiveness, sticking with what you believe is important.
Sticking with the plan.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's think about that in terms of parenting. So.
Well, that's easy in terms of parenting, that's for sure.
Right, piece of cake.
Well, not to do it, but to think about it.
Yeah. Yes, thinking about it is a lot easier, right? I hear you.
Because I think that's usually the problem, is that unsure parents give up.
Mm. Mm-hmm. When they're unsure of what?
Well, parenting decisions, first of all, there's so much advice out there,
You bet.
right?
Yeah. What you should and shouldn't be doing.
What you should and should be doing. And now I'm worried I'll screw up my kid forever, and he'll have attachment issues and abandonment issues and have to go to therapy and complain about me and la, la, la. So
When I'm working with people, I just tell people, don't worry about it. It's already done.
Right.
You're already screwing them up. Just don't worry about it so much and get on with it.
Get on with it. I do too. I say the exact same thing.
Bigger than you. It's bigger than you.
So that's heredity. So
I forgot what you're going to say. It's easy to think about. Go ahead.
Well, yes. What happened was that gentleman just drove by again with his bad words. That's what happened. So I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I have to reorient to the here and now, which I have an improved ability to do thanks to Neuroptimal. So.
Lorna had, just for anybody, Lorna had an angry somebody in the parking lot, not connected with Lorna, but anyway, he came back apparently.
Came back, rolled by with some good rhetoric. So, so I think it's two things with parenting. I really do. I think it's being unsure, but I do also think that maybe this is a fairly new phenomenon, but I know it's true for myself. Very invested in the approval of my children.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I don't like being in the position of them being angry with me.
Yeah.
And also, most parents, myself included, are very sensitive to distress in our children, as of course the children are in us.
Yeah.
So all of these emotional ties serve to keep the status quo.
Yeah.
And breaking the status quo involves, it must, tolerating discomfort.
Yeah, and I like what you said earlier about tolerating and what you can tolerate, and being sort of clear about your own limitations. Does that make sense? Like, don't try to act like you don't care. If you want to make a different move with your kids, do something that is doable, that is realistic and doable. When my kids were little, I think we used to say no screen time for 7 days. What was that? We couldn't make it through that. So it turned into a couple days, and then it turned into a day. But we had to be realistic about what we could do. And it might not have been perfect, but it was what we could follow through with.
Well, a little bit of deliberate sort of, I'm going to hold on to myself and I'm going to think this through. A little bit of that is certainly better than none. Mm-hmm. And nobody expects it to be 100%.
Yeah, except us, right?
Well, except oneself, of course, right?
Right, that's what I mean.
Yeah. I've talked to many parents about changing the relationship between self and the child regarding homework and grades and following up with the teachers. People often really can see pretty quickly how anxiety driven that process is, how they extrapolate, oh my God, if my kid doesn't do well in second grade, he'll never get into a good college, his life will be ruined. And they can see where that kind of thinking is not particularly productive. Mm-hmm. And they can make some changes, but there'll be some place where they just know they can't let go. Mm-hmm. No, I can't stop, waking my kid up in the morning. I just will be too anxious, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think where we should bring this conversation, we just have a few minutes left, is beginning to think about when one parent begins to make these changes and the other parent isn't, for whatever reason, at that time. Like, you don't get the thank you back, right? Like a parent who says, you know what, I can see that all of my worry and projection on my kid, that they're going to be a high school dropout, and I can begin to let go of that. But my spouse thinks, thinks that and is really sort of putting the gas pedal on that. My kid's a loser and I've got to, so how do you think about when one parent makes that shift and the other one just sort of puts on the gas pedal or doesn't make the shift? What is that one parent to think or do, or what do you think about that?
I think last time you and I talked about the United Front, and that is not, in my opinion, you may share it, the desirable goal.
United Front is a battle term, by the way, too. Like, are we in a battle with our kids? Right?
Oh, gosh.
Right? Is that the stance we want to have with them?
When I've started to think about, and I know what it felt like when I was a little girl, on the rare occasions where my parents would team up, how it was overwhelming and terrible for me, But I think that, first of all, the problems in the problems in the family, not just the problems, everything is actually in the triangle. So even though I've been talking about between parent and child, the two, the triangle is always there, lurking in the background, and it's very helpful to think about how all three people, not always, but stereotypically mother, father, and child are handling and positioning and contributing to the status quo. And an effort at differentiation of self would be it's always an individual effort, thinking about how I'm going to relate, not just to my child, but to the other relevant people. It might be grandma, might have a lot of opinions.
You bet. Mm-hmm.
Could be spouse. And thinking through how, if I am going to position myself differently regarding homework, what will that look like with the child and with the spouse and with a nosy grandma, maybe.
You bring up a really important term that I think probably most people listening have never heard or don't really understand, and that's the idea of the triangle. That's one of the core concepts in Bowen theory. A lot of people have heard triangulation and they sort of think, oh, that's a bad thing, and we don't think of it as a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. It actually functions as either a very good thing, because the two-person relationship is so fundamentally unstable that when tension builds up, a third person will be invited in. That one example, it's not the only way it works, but one example would be if there's tension between two people and one goes to a friend and complains about the other person. That's how a triangle is activated in that case. And that can calm things down. It is a stabilizing function.
Right.
Another example of a triangle, that's ubiquitous in every parent's life is, bonding over the infant. And there's nothing wrong with that. It can become problematic, but it's not inherently problematic. So heightening one's awareness about how everybody in the family is participating. The problem may look like it's in one member, but everybody's relating to it, participating in it, contributing to it.
Yeah, and that might be a nice jumping off point for our next one. We got to wrap up for today, but really sort of thinking about things in terms of triangles in ways that I think people can really apply. It's not some concept, out here that's, for academicians, but a real working concept that I think people can use.
I completely agree, and it's wonderful to have our idea for the next podcast already set.
There you go. All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us. When we conclude the recording, they're going to post Lorna's information and mine as well if you want to get started with neurofeedback, or if you want to talk with us about other things. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.